It's time for us to check back in with the People and Their Quilts and see what John Rice talks about next, see who he interviews. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Ethel Hall. A few miles southeast of Hazard, Kentucky, in the village of Jeff, I saw an old gentleman working in his garden. Although it was in early February, he had turnips, spinach, lettuce, onions, and radishes already growing. He also had well-pruned grapevines and various types of fruit trees on his tiny lot of less than an acre. Anyone this industrious, I thought, would surely know the area and would know where I might find some old-time quilters. Indeed, he did know the region. He directed me to Boyd Hall's place, which was located on the left fork of Mason's Creek, a few miles up the hollow from the community of Viper, home of Jean Ritchie, perhaps the country's best-known singer of old-time mountain ballads. I finally found the left fork of Mason's Creek, but had to make several inquiries to find the Boyd Hall home place. I was impressed by the warm, friendly manner in which I was greeted by every single person. The last place I stopped to ask directions was at a tiny country store. The woman operator volunteered to lock the store and go with me to the Halls, who happened to be her parents. I found the old log house now clothed with white weatherboarding, and I found 92-year-old Boyd Hall supervising the spring plowing of his garden. He was also supervising a half a dozen children who followed the turning plow, picking up red worms for fishing bait. Among those who were assisting in the bait gathering was Joanne, the youngest of his 18 children. Boyd was as affable and friendly as everyone else in that area. He said that if I was interested in quilts, I'd have to see his wife Ethel. When Ethel came to the door, she had a large butcher knife in her hand, holding it in such a manner as to cause some apprehension about her intent. My first impression was that she was going to the creek meadow below the house to get dry land creases and other early plants for dinner, and this turned out to be the case. I asked her about quilts, and before long we were in her tiny attic room, or hole as Boyd called it. She had her quilting frame suspended from the ceiling, and around it there were 4 trunks, all filled with quilts, and piled high with other quilts which could not fit into the trunks. Most of the quilts were ones she had made, beautiful and colorful, and far superior to most of those of her contemporaries. She also had plain everyday quilts she had made strictly for use, and old quilts made by her grandmother. After we had taken several quilts to the porch and into the yard to be photographed, I asked this remarkable woman about her quilting and about her life in the Kentucky mountains. "Ethel, tell me about your early life, where you were born, where you grew up, and about your marriage." "I was raised here in yonder, born across the mountains over around Wise, Virginia. I was a cook," her family name, "before I married. My daddy was a coal miner, had 8 children, and raised 5 of us. He'd go from one mine to another over in Virginia and down here in Harlan." "Well, tell me how you got started making quilts." "My grandmother made quilts, just the old-timey tack quilts, just pieced up, like the one I showed you out there a while ago. That's why I've kept her old quilts, you know, to show what she's done back in her days. My mother would make a quilt every now and then, old everyday quilts, but mostly Grandma would make quilts for my mother to use. Her name was Sarah Jane Cook. She was a breedin' before she married. I never quilted much till after I married Boyd here. He'd been married before and had 5 little children when I married him and 1 dead. We started having children of our own, so we had to have a lot of bed cover, and that's when I really started quilting. I had 12 children of my own. Back then we didn't have none of this here 'lectricity, and we didn't have no sich thing as 'lectric blankets. You just had to pile quilts on to keep warm in the winter. Law, when I come here, this was just an old log house, had 3 rooms is all they was, and a loft. Me and Jim, one of the older boys, we went out in the woods and cut timber ourselves and hauled the logs to the sawmill and got the lumber sawed. Then we'd pile the rough lumber here in front of the fireplace, and we'd dress it down with them old hand planes of a night. We sealed over the old rough logs and we weatherboarded the outside and painted it white. Then we added on the new kitchen there and that back room, and we added that porch on the front and side and the back porch too. But we didn't have nothing like a living room back when I come here, just the kitchen and these 2 rooms. We put the boys in one bed, sometimes 4 or 5, and the girls in the other. The first quilts you made, I suppose they were not the pretty fancy quilts like you make now. Oh no, I first started out on the tack quilts, piecing up from old overalls. Boyd wore old overalls all the time then. I'd use any good pieces from them overalls after he'd worn them out, and pieces of old coats and things people would give us. They had a clothing sale up here at Blackley at Robinson School, and we'd go up there and buy bundles of clothes, 25-cent bundles, and I'd take stuff out of that and cut them old clothes up and make clothes for all the children. We didn't have no money to buy no cloth. What kind of work has Boyd followed? Well, he worked on WPA in the coal mines a few years, and he worked around for people, you know, and building these roads, and he had an old horse, and he'd plow for people to buy us a little something to eat and to buy feed for the horse. They'd pay him so much a day. We had a hard time living. While he was working off, me and the kids would farm. Yeah, we raised our own corn, made our own meal. I had an old cow too, and we took and raised feed for her. Fodder, we'd save our fodder. We raised our potatoes, beans, corn, stuff like that, you know. I had my chickens, you know, and we got eggs. Raised cane and made our molasses. Butter and molasses tasted pretty good to me then. We didn't have nothing fancy like hamburgers and hot dogs and stuff like that. What did you do with the little children, the babies, while you were out working in the fields? Well, we had a bigger child, to stay here and take care of my little children. I tell ye, I'd go out and leave my babies and they would be 2 weeks old. I'd go out in the field and leave my little babies, and they'd feed 'em, you know, a little milk and stuff. I'd come in and let the little fellers nurse. They nursed the breast. Buddy, I've worked like a man. Spring of the year come, I used to put on my overalls and tie up my head and put me on a coat and go back there in the field with my mattock and go back there and grub from daylight till dark and snow just a-flying. I tell you, we had to make our own living and raise our family. When you say grubbing, you're talking about digging out the young tree sprouts. Many people wouldn't know what grubbing is today, would they? No, not many people knows what it is today. They wouldn't know hardly what kind of tool you'd use to grub with. I used a mattock and an axe, or just anything to get that sprout out of the ground, work all day long, come in just long enough to get a little snack, and then take off back to grubbing. You had to go way down in the ground and get all the roots, or it'd come back on you. I don't suppose that you had a mowing machine. We didn't have no sich thing in them days, didn't have no money to buy one, and if we did have, the mountainside was too steep to get on. If you cut a sprout off, it just keeps coming back every year, and you just have to go on cutting it. But once you dig it out by the roots, then you're through with it. In addition to your 5 stepchildren, you had 12 of your own. How were you able to provide medicine and pay the doctor bills? We made our own, what we had. There's certain kinds of tea that's good for certain diseases. I made spicewood tea, sassafras tea, and I've made peppermint tea and catnip tea. I used wild cherry bark for tonic and to build up our blood. We used slip elm bark to chew for a laxative. For worms, for our children, we'd take molasses and boil them down and put this worm pepper seed in them. I bet you know what it is. It growed wild and we'd go gather it. It's got a kind of peculiar taste to it, and it'll sure bring the worms. Did you go to the hospital when your children were born? Never had a child in a hospital in my life. I had a doctor 3 times with my children, but the rest of them were with midwives. They call them granny women. They didn't charge hardly anything, but you pay dear now if you go to the hospital. Most of my babies were delivered by Granny Hetty Caudle and another old lady called Granny Mark Caudle. Now them two delivered a lot of babies. They just lived right over here on the top of the mountain about 3 miles. They some akin to each other, but I don't know how much. Boy'd have to go get 'em, sometimes in the middle of the night. Sometimes he'd go on the old horse, and sometimes he'd walk. They'd stay with you all day and all night if they had to, and sometimes longer. And they'd charge about $5. My first babies was twins, twin girls, and it was 5 years then before I had another baby. He was my oldest boy. I had one boy killed in a car wreck in 1955. He'd been in the Army, and he'd just come back home, I think about 12 days. Back then, you couldn't even get a horse and a buggy up this hollow. Doc Combs, old Dr. Combs, we used to have him once in a while when the children were bad sick. He had a big fat horse, and he'd unhitch him from the buggy and come up here a few times. Well, we've talked about how you first made quilts soon after you married, and we've talked about your farming and outside work. We haven't talked much about your quilting in recent years. I'd quilt mostly in the wintertime, 'cause in the summertime I had to get out and make something to eat. In a winter, I've made as high as 8 or 10 quilts, pieced them by the piece or pieced them in fans. I'd put all the pieces together of a night by the fire, and then the next day when I could see, I'd do the quilting. I was 18 when I married, and I've been quilting ever since. Every winter, that's my hobby. Every winter, I sit right upstairs there and make quilts. You must have given many of your quilts away. Lord, yeah. Every Christmas, that's their Christmas present, and their birthday presents, or something or another like that. I've got a girl in Indiana, and she ain't got a quilt in her house but what I hadn't made her. I've give that one over there, she points to her youngest daughter Joanne, 2 or 3. I made her an awful purty one and give her a brand new one for my grandbaby. I've made my grandchildren quilts and give 'em. Well, they'll appreciate them someday a lot more than they do now. Well, some of them say they're going to put them in their hope chests and keep them to remember Mamaw by. They call me Mamaw. My grandchildren are just as great to me as my own children. I love 'em just as good. Down in Tennessee, most of the old people raised a little cotton, but they had to plant it very early, and even then it hardly matured before frost. I was wondering if cotton could be raised this far north to use as batting for quilts. My grandmother, when she gardened, I can remember her planting it and raising it. She used to live up the holler up here that they call Ben Davis Holler. She raised just a little cotton, just bunches here and yonder. I tell you what she did do. When she's a-livin', every fall, you've seed these milkweeds, ain't you? You know what they are? That stuff that busts out and looks like feathers? She'd take her a big sack, and when them busted out, she'd go gather enough of that to make her fillin' with. This was a most interesting and revealing bit of information which I had never heard before, but this fluffy, silk-like substance similar to fine down would likely work extremely well for this purpose. What else was used for padding? What we used most in them days for padding was the linings out of old coats. You know they've got a quilting in them. Put them together and make padding for them quilts. Or either we'd take old wore-out quilts and put them in there and make padding out of them. If you have an old wore-out blanket, you could use that. Now them that you saw out there, they're mostly padded with old wore-out blankets, except that one that my grandmother made, and I think she padded it with old wore-out shirts and things like that. Made it at hazard, laid it on a bed and tacked it. That's the way I tack all my quilts, lay them on a bed and tack them out. I don't quilt with a thimble. You know what I make a thimble out of? These old overall cloth. You ought to see my thimble. I'm scared to death when I get a thimble on my finger. I sure am. I don't know. Seems like I'm afraid that needle will slip out and hit me in the hand, you know. I take that cloth thimble, and buddy, that needle don't slip. It'll go through that sometimes, though. Right here's what I quilt with. Shows me the thimble made out of old overalls. See right here now where that needles went in that thick part. Did you ever see anybody else do that? No, just picked it up myself. I just knowed I had to have a thimble of some kind to protect my fingers, and I made that. I've done that all my life, quilting like that. Now my children quilt with a thimble. I've talked with a woman the other day that stood up all the time while she quilted. Well, I stand up a whole lot. I get tired of sitting, and I get up and stretch my legs. See, I've had a stroke back about 2 years ago, and it hurts me to sit so long. After I sit so long, my legs, my left side, gets numb. How many hours a day do you quilt? I go up there every morning after I clean my house up. I go upstairs. I come downstairs about 1 or 2 o'clock and cook something to eat. We eat, and I wash my dishes up, and I go back upstairs and stay till about 4:30 and come down and do up the work. Don't you ever get tired and lonesome sitting up there all day in that little room by yourself quilting? No, I never get tired. I just love to quilt. I'd rather quilt than eat on the hungriest day ever I seen. Ethel Hall of the left fork of Mason's Creek near Viper in the East Kentucky Mountains is shown here during the author's interview with her in February 1983. Ethel Hall left and her daughter Joanne hold an overall tack quilt made by Ethel's grandmother. The back of the overall quilt is made from fertilizer sacks which apparently originated in Argentina. 92-year-old Boyd Hall with his wife Ethel and Joanne, the youngest of his 18 children and the youngest of Ethel's 12 children. When I married Boyd and came here when I was 18 years old, this was just a little log cabin. Me and the boys went to the woods, cut the timber, sawed it, and added these rooms and porches, Ethel states. She is shown here sunning a few of her quilts. Dorothea Elkins of New Lewiston, 72 years a quilter. Dorothea George Elkins lives in a peaceful and pastoral valley at the edge of the village of New Lewiston, some 20 miles north of Knoxville. Her house is an early hand-hewn log one, though it's now covered inside and out so that one would never suspect its pioneer vintage. Dorothea has been living in the comfortable old home since she married Charlie Elkins in 1921. Her mother, Ida George, was a quilter, and some of her quilts are included elsewhere in this book. Dorothea helped her mother quilt as a girl and made some everyday quilts in the first years of her marriage. She helped operate the dairy farm, raised a garden each year, helped her husband operate his country store for half a century, and raised 4 children. She was not active as a quilter during these years, but in 1964, the children were grown, the farming chores and management had largely been assumed by others, and Dorothea again took up quilting. She has made dozens since that time. She talked about how quilting had changed through the years. Back then, when I was first married, we just used anything we could get to make quilts out of. Take men's clothes and cut the best out of them, you know. They call them comforts. They're tacked in. Well, they wasn't no pattern to them. Just sew them in strips. They's awful thick. Where they was made out of thick material, they'd tack them and just call them comforts. They's heavy too, but them old heavy wool quilts felt good then on a cold night. This house wasn't like it is now. It was open and had an old chimney at the other end of that kitchen, and it was open, and I tell you we like to froze to death. That was in 1939. Law me, you raised 3 boys and a girl, and me and Charlie, we used a whole lot of quilts back then. That was the only cover we had. We'd have 5 or 6 quilts on every bed. But now we use all the pretty patterns. The quilts are not made so much for warmth as they are to look pretty. I make 3 or 4 every winter, but some winters I wouldn't make but 2. Quilting is enjoyable and it helps to pass off the time. Yeah, I've been wanting to put me up another quilt, but then I think it's too big a job for me, but I like to quilt. Dorothea George Elkins, like tens of thousands of quilters from across the country, has numerous quilt tops packed away in her upstairs trunks and quilt chests. This intricately stitched tulip quilt is one of many Dorothea Elkins has made and carefully packed away. The quilt shown here at Dorothea Elkins' home is one she has packed away in the upstairs cedar chest since she made it several years ago. Pauline Lay of White County, Tennessee, with a quilt made by her great-great-grandmother. Pauline Brown Lay, like several generations of her ancestors, is a native of White County in Middle Tennessee. Her interest and affinity for quilts is perhaps traceable to the encounter she had as a child with her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and their quilts. She is shown here with the four-pointed star quilt made by her great-great-grandmother, Marge Brown of the Doyle community in White County, Tennessee. Pauline talked about this tattered quilt with feeling and affection. My daddy always liked that quilt and claimed it, but his grandmother never gave it to him. She was part Indian and sort of a funny lady. Anyway, it was claimed by Daddy, and they all knew it, and when his grandmother died, they gave the quilt to him. She had used it 50 years, I guess, but after Daddy got it, him and Mother only used it occasionally. They didn't want to wear it out because Daddy thought so much of it. He had dreamed about having that quilt since he slept under it as a child. When her niece, Chris Keyes, brought Pauline by the museum recently, I plied her with questions about quilts, and her quiet, reticent personality turned to one of enthusiasm. "Oh, I do like to quilt. My mother started quilting when she was a young girl, and she quilted 60 years, I guess. My grandmother before her quilted, and I would say she quilted 70 years. I don't just sit down and quilt all day long. I quilt between times when I don't have anything else to do. I quilt a lot at night while my husband watches TV, and he says, 'What do you want to make more quilts for? You've got more quilts now than you'll ever use.' And I say, 'Well, I can sit here and quilt, and when spring comes, I've got something to show for what I've done, and you don't have one thing.'" The Martin sisters of Panther Creek. Sisters Maud Martin left and Isla Mae are shown here in front of the old home place, holding one of the many quilts made by their mother and grandmother. I don't know how many chests and trunks full of quilts there are in the large Martin farmhouse a few miles above Sneedville, Tennessee. I visited with the three Martin sisters often over a period of many years, and while they were most friendly and jovial, they were never wont to show off their antiques and household relics. It was almost dark when Robin and I stopped there on the way home from a day with Alex Stewart. I asked Isla Mae if they had any old quilts, and she laughed heartily at the question. "Why, son, they's trunks and chests full of 'em. But you know how Maud is. She's queer. She probably won't let you get them out." Indeed, Maud was reluctant, but finally agreed to open a large chest which sat near the fireplace in the living room. She barely opened the lid, but enough for us to see that it was filled with what appeared to be old and unused quilts. Not only did we not get into any of the bedrooms nor any of the upstairs rooms, we didn't get beyond the top quilt in this one chest. Maud pulled the first quilt out, then quickly closed the lid. So we may all wonder how many fine old quilts there are packed away in the rambling white house on Panther Creek. Maud Martin left and her sister knit, never married, and have spent their lives at the old home place. In the springtime, Maud said, "We have a job sunning all them quilts and coverlets." Photographed by the author. Maud, who is 83 and who puts in a day's work every day, is holding the quilt which her mother made. Photographed by the author. We'll stop right there today. Makes you wonder what happened to those quilts. They wouldn't let John Rice look at them, and makes you wonder what happened to them. Hopefully somebody in their family got them and used them. Maybe even after this book, maybe John Rice ended up with them. I don't know. Those three, though, they sound like real characters, don't they? It's funny sometimes when older people not just older people, I guess even younger people, he used that word choir. That's a word you'd hear in lots of places in Appalachia, but definitely in the southern mountains here and where John Rice was at. It just means somebody strange. They're a little odd if they're choir. A little strange, maybe they're a little backward, but mostly they're just strange like that. Like she didn't want him. It's, she's probably thinking it's none of your business and I'm not going to show you my quilts. Reminds me of a few older ladies that I know that are real worried about their privacy and things like that. Now you may notice that I'm started saying John Rice. That's because a dear friend in the last week told me that she worked, and I already knew that she'd worked for him for a long time at the Museum of Appalachia, but I guess something hearing me read and hearing me say his name made her think to tell me is that lots of people called him John Rice. Some people called him John, but a lot of people called him that double name, John Rice. So I thought that really made my day when she told me that, and I thought I'm gonna try to do that too. So this part of the book was really interesting. The first little part about Ethel Hall, my goodness, what hard work, all those descriptions. Well, first, even before he got to her and talked about and interviewed her, just what John Rice had to go through to get there, how he stopped, seen the yard with the man in it, and he was industrious, and in February already had his spring vegetables growing and had tended his grapevines and his fruit trees. Oh my, I wish I could go back and see that garden and talk to him. Anyway, so I liked that part, and then the picture of John Rice stopping here and there, asking, trying to get to Boyd and Ethel's house, and finally he stops at the little country store, and it just so happens that that's one of their daughters. That's so neat, isn't it? Anyway, but then he gets there, and then Ethel tells him about all that hard work. My goodness, I can't even imagine. I can't begin to imagine. And then still, she found time to quilt, and not just, again, goes all through this book. We've talked about the necessity of quilting, but also she enjoyed it. So that was something she looked forward to. That was her, I guess that was her entertainment and what she liked to do. I liked the part that she said about the grandchildren. She said she loved all her children, and she said she loved all her grandchildren too, just the same. I really loved that. Of course, makes me really look forward to my grandchildren, since I have 2 on the way. So that struck me, am I going to feel like them, like I do about Corey and Katie? Because see, I've never had grandchildren, so I don't know. Now I've been told, how wonderful it is, and I've had people tell me it's even better than your own kids, and I think, well, how could that be? Anyway, but I like how she put that she loved her kids, but she loved her grandkids just the same. So that was really sweet. And then probably the most interesting thing that she talked about is something that John Rice noted there too, is milkweed, that her grandmother collected milkweed. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen milkweed or not. I have. It grows along my bank out here in the fall, and on a certain day when the wind blows, you can see it floating through the air. I cannot imagine, though, going around, and because it's just little, I can't imagine going around and picking, being that industrious, and that I guess the necessity, but also the desire to go around and gather that and save it and then to put it inside a quilt. I just cannot imagine. It is really silky, like John Rice indicate. He said called it silky. It is. If you get it, and every year I do just for the fun of it, get it and do like this and let it blow away in the wind. Even if it's not blowing, it'll go in the air currents. It is silky, but anyway, please share if you've ever heard anything like that. And of course, as he was indicating when he was asking her, the farther north you go, the harder it would be to grow cotton for sure. And even where she's at there in Kentucky would be a little bit harder maybe than where he was normally talking to the people in Tennessee or where he had been. So really, really interesting. And then the next lady he talked to, Dorothea, she was really interesting too. They all are, but she talked about that necessity, and then she talked about you could almost like thinking about. He said how quilts had changed over the years. Well, they have, obviously. Even in that, her talking about them, you can tell they've changed. Even in her quilt life, I guess you would say, or her experience over her lifetime with quilts. But interesting that she was mostly talking about how that they, in the beginning, they had to make those big heavy quilts, and they didn't really care about the pattern or anything like that. They were more utilitarian, and they were tacked. And then the quilts that she's making there at the end of her life are the patterns, and they're beautiful, all the different shapes and all that. and that's interesting, just the two different things of quilts. He explained this in the very beginning. We've kind of talked about it with every person about it he's talked to has said that kind of is the evolution of their quilt. But I couldn't help but think of it like in a more objective way of just how even, and this was, you know, a long time ago now. It makes me feel old, but it really was a long time ago when he wrote the book. But even then, they had come so far from where they had started at. Thinking about, like, I think I live in the land of plenty. I do. I don't just think it. But even they were living in the land of plenty compared to where they had started out. Now, two of them talked about those houses when they first moved in them, and you can just imagine probably the cold air come in, and you know all the stories you've heard about waking up with snow on the quilts and stuff. I'm sure, but both of them, the ladies, they both said that about how that they, you know, this house didn't look like that back then, and made that point to tell him. Anyway, but you can see, so they went, Dorothea there, she went from when they had to have each bed had to have 5, 6 quilts on it just to stay warm, all the way till the point when he was interviewing her that now we just use them because they're pretty. Because, you know, the house is more insulated and all that. Probably they had better heat too. Maybe they had that electricity she was talking about then, and they had better heat. Anyway, really interesting to think about that. Both the changes in the quilting, just the basic quilt, but also in what was going on in their lives. That really struck me there. So I hope you liked this part. I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you. I'm so glad that he was able to go. I mean, John Rice did so many things. I wish I could have met him. Of course, I never did. I've never even been to the Museum of Appalachia. I'd like to go someday. But even just his interviews alone would be worth so much, hearing directly from these everyday people. Much less all the things he collected and put in the museum. You know, that's an amazing thing too. And I've had people tell me how wonderful it is and that I should go, and I hope to go someday. But just his interviews, you know, all those years he spent with Alex Stewart, and if you missed that reading, I can link to that and you can go back. It's amazing. And it just took his dedication to keep going over the years and recording him, and then to compile it all into a book. But even just these little short interviews with these sweet dear ladies and men, there's been some men quilters too, how wonderful that he did that. I'm so thankful so that we can enjoy it today. Please leave a comment and let me know what jumped out at you. And as always, I hope you drop back by next Friday. We've got to see who John Rice talks to next.